Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. If this is the first time you've stumbled upon my channel, welcome. Make sure you subscribe, click the like button if you enjoyed this tutorial, and also select that little bell that pops up right next to the area once you've subscribed. That way you'll be notified of any future tutorials that I create. Today I'm going to share with you my process of placing and constructing all of my 4x4 quilted block designs together. It was a fun series that I offered about a month or so ago to where you stayed along with me. There was 12 altogether, and each week I released a free design. And if you got in on that freebie, so exciting, right? But if you didn't, they're still available over on my website. I'll link my website down in the description and you can pick those designs up. Now, today we're going to place this all together. We're going to walk through how I put my smaller blocks together to create this smaller quilt. I like doing things that are small at times. I think they're fun projects. There's definitely a place for them. You can use them in so many different areas to accent around your house. Who knows where you might want to place something like this. Maybe you just want to fill a little spot on your wall that seems a little empty. Let's get started with the tutorial. I am ready to put together my blocks from the Quilted Block series that are designed to fit in your 4x4 embroidery hoop. If you'll notice, I have them already laid out. I stitched mine onto white fabric and I used a variety of different embroidery thread colors. So now I've just arranged all of my blocks in a way that are pleasing to my eye. This is going to be a smaller quilt because these are smaller blocks. So I wanted to start by just letting you know what the measurements of the pieces that I'm going to use to create the sashings in between each and every one of the blocks on each one of the rows. So here I already have that cut out. Let's grab one little stack. So I have mine cut and I have them arranged to where they're separated. Each one of these sets are going to be used in between two of the blocks on each row. Okay, so I'm going to cut enough of these to fit in between each one of my blocks on the rows. So I'm calling these my short sashings. So let's look at what one short sashing set consists of. I have a single piece of fabric. This fabric measures 2 inches wide and 4 3/4 inches tall. And then I've also cut a layer of batting that's the exact same size. So 2 inches wide by 4 3/4 inches tall. And I've cut them in that measurement just so they extend a bit longer or taller than what the block itself is. Right, so we have that cut. And then you're going to need a piece that measures, once again, 4 3/4 inches high. But this one we want to do 3 3/4 inches wide. And then once you have those cut, these that measure 3 3/4 inches wide, you want to press them in half, wrong sides together, so you have a folded edge on one edge. And that's what you're going to do for your sets, and you're going to need 8 sets. So 1, 2, 4, 6, 8. Once you get those cut out, you'll be ready to stitch along with me if you'd like to, or just go ahead and watch me stitch one together, and then when you're ready, you can do yours yourself. I'm going to start with my top row. Here's the first 2 blocks of my first row. Here's the third block, but we're going to place together the first 2 blocks. And we'll start on the right edge of my first block. We're going to grab one of our pieces, the one that's been folded in half. We've got the folded edge here. We're going to take the raw edges of the strip and place them right sides together to the top of our block. And once again, it's on the right edge of the block. Now, in the tutorials, in the construction tutorials, when we were actually embroidering our blocks, We talked a little bit about trimming the block. So if your block was a bit shy of 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, if you'll notice when I trimmed it, I trimmed using the line, which I show in that tutorial, and I'll link it down in the description block. But I made sure that I trimmed it 1/4 of an inch out from the line. So this is why you see a little bit of stabilizer just kind of peeking out. So we're going to align those raw edges to the raw edge of the stabilizer. And you can also notice that these pieces are wider than the block. We just want to center this strip along the block so you have a little bit to the right and a little bit to the left. So let's go ahead and kind of get that started. And then we'll slip a pin or two. I'm going to flip it around to the back side because I think you'll be able to see it a little bit better also from the opposite side once I get a couple of pins in. Okay, we got those pins. Let's just flip it over. So let's take a look. There we go. We've got those edges of the stabilizer along the edges of the raw fabric. Now we're going to take our single strip of fabric and we're going to place it right sides together along the top edge. And here you can see very clearly that we've got more fabric extended on each outer edge. And we're just going to place it and align it with those previous raw edges. We'll remove the pin, slip it back in to hold all of the layers. And we'll do the same thing with that one. Now that we've got that in place, we're going to take our single piece of batting and add it to the recipe, to the little stack of fabric that we have building here. I'm just making sure all of my little edges are even. And once again, I'm going to remove the pin, reposition it, and pin it with the batting included. I'm just going to go ahead and also slip a pin closer to the ends. And this is the same process that we did in our larger quilted block designs for our 4x4 patch block that we created. But now we've got some differences in sizes on our sashings and our piecings that are going together. But the concept is quite the same. All right, I'm going to slip this over upside down. Now we're going to stitch a 3/8 inch seam allowance from the edge of the fabric in. So set your machine up for a 3/8 inch seam allowance and let's stitch our seams. Now that our seam's been stitched, it's time for some pressing. I'm going to take it over to my pressing station and I'm going to press the sashing away from the block. I'll do the exact same thing on the opposite side. So I'm going to go do my pressing and then we'll come back and we'll stitch our second block onto the next side. I've pressed the sashings. Now it's time to take our second block in our first row and add it over to the opposite side of the single sashing and the batting. And in order to do that, we want the back of this block to go towards the back of our first block. So this is the right side, the front. These are the front sides. And if I flip it around like this, now we're going to have the back of this block along the back of this block. Now we will only want to pin this block to the single sashing and the one layer of batting. And when we're placing these together, what we want to be mindful of is to align the right edges of this block with the right edges of our base block, our first block. So I'm going to go ahead and just kind of get those visually lined up on each side, and then I'll make sure to scoot them up to the top edge. So we're going to be flush here and straight, and we're going to be aligned here, and we'll be aligned on this side, and then we'll place some pins to hold it all together, and we'll take it to the machine and stitch it together. And this is going to help us have the rows, the blocks together straight. That way they're not wonky. We're going to try our best to keep it straight. Okay, now that we've got them pinned together, once again, just the single batting and single sashing. The folded edge is still down underneath. We won't be stitching any of that in the seam. Let's go ahead and stitch our seam. Now that we've stitched that together, we've got our seam in, we can open the block, the two blocks up. Let's look at the back side. So you'll notice that now we have our finished sashings on the back. We're going to give it a press. I'm going to go press my seams nice and neat, and then we'll come and we will pin and top stitch this side of our sashing down to this block. Now that I've pressed the sashing, it's going to lay nice and neat. There's the back, and here's our front. We need to top stitch this piece over. So first we're going to pin. I want to position the folded edge to where it covers that stitch line. So here's the stitch line that we just created when we put the seams together. This one right here is our outer line for our block itself when we embroidered it. So we're going to take that folded edge and just line it up right on top of that stitch line. And then we'll grab a pin. And then we'll pin it in place. We want to do that along the edge until we have it all pinned and ready to top stitch. Now that it's all pinned, we're going to top stitch. I'm using my walking foot to attach my sashings, and it has the batting in it, so that's giving it some more thickness. So I really like using my walking foot. This is my digital dual feed foot because I have more control from the top of the fabric to the base of the fabric. And I'm switching over to my Stitch in the Ditch sole. This is going to allow me to guide really easily along the folded edge of the fabric when we're stitching. Now I'm going to scoot my needle over quite a few clicks. I'm going to go about 9 clicks over, and that's going to top stitch down this side. So let me go ahead and do that. So now that I've moved my needle over, I'm ready to top stitch. So I'm going to remove this pin and align the guide on my presser foot. I'm also going to lengthen my stitch to 3.0. I like the way when I'm doing top stitching on something that has batting in it for a quilted look, I just like to lengthen that stitch length. Now on my video that I did the construction of the 4x4 quilt blocks, which are the larger designs, I really did go in more depth about how my settings on my machine are. And if you want to see that, don't forget to head over there and watch those tutorials also. All right, let's go ahead and top stitch this edge onto our block. Look how pretty it looks with that stitch length a bit longer. Again, that's what I like. I just like the way it looks. Now that our top stitching is done, I'm going to give it a press and then we'll rotate it around and we'll top stitch the opposite side. Our top stitching looks really pretty. Now, as I was showing you how to construct the sashings between the blocks, I did my construction first and then I top stitch. And you notice when I top stitched, I changed the sole of my presser foot for my guide. Now, I would totally recommend that you do all of your construction between all of your sashings and blocks first. That way you're doing one step throughout the whole process. Once you've gotten the folded sashing stitched on along with your back batting and your single sashing in between each one of the blocks, get them all pressed, and then come back and do all your top stitching together. That way you're working very much easier, smoothly. It's going to take you less time to do all of those light steps at the same time. Okay, I'm going to get all of mine put together and then I'll show you what it looks like. If you're stitching with me, go ahead and get all of yours put together also. I've attached all of my short sashings in between each and every one of my blocks on each row. So now it's time to trim. I've already trimmed these 3 rows. I thought we would trim this row together. I'm just going to grab my ruler and my rotary cutter, and I want to align the ruler on the top edge of the blocks where I know they're already trimmed accurately. And then we'll just trim off the extra sashing. Once that's done, we'll just rotate it around and we'll do the opposite side exactly the same way. Now that we're finished with those steps, it's time for us to add our sashings in between each one of the rows. We're ready to apply and construct our sashings that are going to run horizontally. We're going to have 2 rows that are going to have some different fabric cuts because one will be below the quilt and one will be at the top. Those are the 2 stacks that I have right there. And then we're going to need 3 other sets of fabrics. I've had those cut right here, and those are going to be a little bit different what's required in these than that will be required in these strip sets. So let me go ahead and just tell you first what you're going to need in our strip sets for the top and the bottom. These 2 are exactly the same. You're going to need 2 sets like this. I have 1, 2 single strips and 1 single batting. And every one of these pieces measures 2 inches high by 14 inches wide. So all 3 of these measure exactly the same. And again, you're going to need 2 sets of these for what I'm showing you in my tutorial today. So here's my 2 sets. I'm going to set that one aside. Now these are the sets that we need for in between. I'm going to lay a couple of them aside. We're only going to look at one. So I'm going to pick up the first strip here. Now here we go. I've got this one folded in half and pressed. It's a single strip of fabric and it measures 3 3/4 inches high by 14 inches wide. And again, I've already pre-pressed these in half, wrong sides together. So it'll be ready for our step. So one of those in each of these strip sets. And then you're going to need a single 2-inch high and 14-inch wide strip. And once again, you're going to need a batting cut that same exact size of the strip. So that's what your strip sets consist of. So I'm going to set these aside and we're going to get started placing our sashing sets in between these rows first. So I'll have these 3 ready to use. Let's go ahead and get these constructed in between our rows. And the way we put these together is really exactly the way we put our short sashings in, but now we're doing it horizontally. So I'm going to grab my folded piece first. I'm going to put it right sides together, so I have a right side over here, and all of those raw edges are going to align at the top of my row. And we want to center this 14-inch strip to where you have a little bit hanging off each edge. I'm going to go ahead and flip it over so you can maybe see me pinning a little bit easier. So we're looking at the back now. Just going to visually align it, keeping those ends a little bit longer on my 14-inch strip. Once I feel like I've kind of got that in place, then I'll start pinning it across. And as we're pinning, we want to make sure all of our top edges are even. Now that we have that all pinned nice and neat, we're going to take our single strip from our pile. We're going to place it right sides together onto the back. And I'll just even up the ends to the piece that I have on the opposite side that we've already arranged. And then I can just continue to move my pins and finish pinning this piece on also. Now that that's on, we'll grab our batting, place it right on top of the back side of that strip, line it up, and pin it in place also. We've got all of our layers together. It's time for us to take it over to the machine and do a 3/8 inch seam allowance all the way down the long edge. So I'm going to head over to my machine. I'm going to stitch that on, and then we'll come back and add this piece to our next row. Now that we've stitched all of those layers on, I went ahead and did some pressing the seams towards the sashing. Pressing just makes things look so much more neat. All right, so now we want to add and attach our single batting and our single sashing to our next row. And we're going to do that to where we have the back of this row and the back of this row together, because there it is, that single sashing and the single batting is on the back. So now I'm going to just go ahead and just kind of bring it up to the next row, pick it up, making sure that I have the backs to the backs. I'm going to flip it around. It's just a little easier for me to see. And we want to align the edge of this block to the edge of this block. That way we know we're going to be spot on and straight. Once that's aligned, then we're going to align the top edges together and we'll pin it in place. We're going to do that all the way across the row. If you want to, you can just head on over to the opposite side, get it lined up, get the top edge lined up, and then you can finish pinning in between the outer edges. And another way for you to kind of do a little extra check is you want to kind of visually have this sashing lined up with this sashing as best you can. Okay, now that we're all pinned, we're going to take it over to the sewing machine and we're going to stitch all the way down with our 3/8 inch seam allowance. Now, I always like to have that batting piece up against my feed dogs. I just feel like that it helps just ease any excess fabric from the bottom since it's against the feed dogs if that's happening. Now it's time to head back to the pressing station to get all nice and neat. Now that it's all pressed, it's time for us to take our folded edge, place it over our stitch line. When we were embroidering, we want to cover up that line and we'll pin it all in place. I'm going to go ahead and rotate this around so you can see this a little bit easier. So I'm going to start from the center and just align that folded edge along that seam line. Grab a pin and slip that pin in place. So it's going to hold it down. And you'll do that all the way down. And this is exactly the same process that we did when we were sewing our short sashings on. Now I'm going to take it over to the machine and we'll top stitch this side down. I've changed my stitch length to 3.0. I've moved my needle over to the left 9 clicks, just like I did whenever I was top stitching on our short sashings. You'll definitely want to make those adjustments. I went ahead and pressed, and now we're going to top stitch the opposite side of the sashing. Now that we finished up this row, I'm going to go ahead and attach my other 2 horizontal rows. Now keep in mind, if I weren't doing the tutorial and videoing, I would actually construct all the rows together first and then do the top stitching after they were all together. That way you don't have to bounce back and forth with your presser foot, sole, or your stitches and your settings on your machine. So this way you can just do all those like steps, and then when you're finished with that, then you can do all your top stitching at one time. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and put my other rows inside my quilt. Now that I have all of my strips, my horizontal strips in, it's time for us to trim those outer edges. So I'm going to go ahead and just turn it, grab my rotary cutter and my ruler, and trim those edges even with the outside edges of the blocks. Now that we finished with that, it's time for us to add those sashings on the top and on the bottom. I'm going to take one of my long strips and place it right sides together. We're at the top now, and we'll just pin that in place, kind of doing the same concept. We want the fabric to extend a little bit on each outer edge. Now that that's pinned, we're just going to flip it over and we're going to add our other sashing and batting. Now we have it all pinned together, so I have that single sashing onto the back, our layer of batting, and on our opposite side we have that one single layer of sashing. We're going to go to the sewing machine and then just go ahead and stitch our 3/8 inch seam allowance. I seamed those sashings on along with the batting, so it's nice and neat. I gave it a good press and then I did my top stitching. I top stitched just inside that top edge, that inside edge of that bottom sashing strips. And then I went ahead and attached my top sashing strips, pressed it nice and neat, top stitched, and you'll notice that I've also trimmed my outer edges, exactly how we've been trimming along our other ones. Now we're ready to add our long sashings along each outer edge of our project. So I have my 2 sets of sashings. That's what you're going to need because we have those 2 outer edges. And I've cut these, once again, they are 2 inches wide. Now I'm going to say wide this time because this strip is going up in this direction. So they're cut 2 inches wide by 21 inches high. So we have 2 of those strips cut for one side. And then we also have a single sashing cut the same measurements. All right, and we need 2 sets of these. Now that we've got that trimmed, it's time for us to pin these in place and stitch them onto the sides of our quilt. Once we've stitched them onto the sides of the quilt, we're going to go ahead and press it, and then we'll top stitch it, and then we'll trim it. So when I add these to each outer edge, it's going to be exactly the same process that I did for the bottom and the top edge. I'm going to go ahead and get that done, and then I'll come back and show you what it looks like. Situation to where you have a little bit of your embroidery line showing, you know, we're just not perfect. So sometimes our sewing might be a little off. Just come in, use your ripper, and take care of that. It's really easy to get that out. If you're a quilter, if you're a seamstress, ripping is just something that we have to embrace. You have to do it sometime. So go ahead, if this happens to you, I just thought I would share it with you because it might happen to you. Just get in there, rip those stitches out from that was your little tack down and your stitches that were on the embroidery side of the design. And I'm going to do this before I do the top stitching. It's all ripped out, and once we wash it or just give it some press, those little stitch holes are going to go away. we have all of our sashings constructed within our blocks, inside our rows, and all the way around the outer edges of our quilt. The last thing that I'm going to do is attach my bindings. Now I'm going to go ahead and cut my bindings out of the same fabric that I've used for sashing. And I'm going to place my binding on my little quilt here using my serger. And I'll link that tutorial down below. That tutorial is going to take you through creating binding and show you exactly how I attach binding to a quilt. That's the same method that I'm going to use when I place my bindings on our 4x4 Quilted Block series block quilt. I really love the way it looks. Okay, let me go ahead and get my binding on. I'm going to go ahead and attach my binding with my serger, and don't forget to head over to the tutorial that will really show you the whole process of how I create binding and place it on with my serger. I'll link that tutorial down in the description. I've finished my quilt with our smaller 4x4 hoop size designs. I hope you enjoyed going along with me in my process of placing my blocks together. Now, you know, there's a few things I feel like that I might kind of experiment with on my next little project like this. I did go back and I added some straight stitch quilting in between the horizontal sashings, and I also quilted around all the way around that outer area a bit too. I just felt like those sashings needed a little more quilting to control them. Now, if you want to see how I do channel quilting when I created the quilt in our larger designs, I'll link that video down below in the descriptions. I was really kind of thinking, since I was using narrower sashings, that maybe I didn't need to add that extra quilting. But when it's all said and done, I just really like the way the quilting tames those flat spaces with the batting and fabric. So I decided to add a little more quilting than what you saw me create. So head over to that tutorial that I linked down in the descriptions if you want to see how that channel quilting can really kind of add that extra oomph to your sashings. I hope you enjoy the tutorial, just kind of taking a little bit of a peek inside my concept of how I like to place embroidery blocks together. A quilt as you go concept, how to put it all together after you've created those embroidery blocks. Maybe you might want to incorporate this type of process into some of your blocks that you've created with your embroidery machine. If you create some of these quilts using some of our quilted block designs, I'm going to place the Facebook link down in the description. Be sure to head over there, request to join, and post pictures of the projects that you finished. I would love to see them. Thanks for joining me for this tutorial, and until next time, go create something, and I look forward to seeing you in the next tutorial.